I'm with Gayle Berkeley, the Director of Information Security at Rubrik. Gayle, thanks so much for taking the time to join me here at StateRAMP.
Thank you so much for having us.
One of the things that we've heard throughout this is to get critical infrastructure, to get other sectors prepared because of the impending threats, right? And we've been, I think, talking about the threats of whether it's nation-state attacks or just random hackers over the last 5, 7, 10 years really been turned up. The word of the day, I think, is cyber resilience. How do you become resilient? Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Mm-hmm. So why do you think cyber resilience has really raised in terms of the need to understand what it is and why it's important in the last year or 2 or 3?
Well, I think cybersecurity has been playing defense for a long time, right? And cyber resilience goes beyond cybersecurity and the concept of defense to basically having a plan for recovery when you get hit. Because it's almost inevitable that everybody gets hit sooner or later, right? You have to be perfect on defense all the time. They only have to be perfect once, right? And they're no longer breaking in, they're logging in. So they get a successful phishing campaign, they move around, then suddenly the next thing you know, ransomware or what have you. We've seen recent attacks like on the Seattle airport, we've seen it in hospitals, we see it in governments, state and local. A lot of people used to think even federal government didn't have to worry about ransomware, and that's no longer true. So resiliency is really about having a plan, being able to recover quickly so that you can continue to deliver your critical services to your citizenship, and then making sure that you are able to, maintain and preserve the security and integrity of your data.
In many ways, the resiliency, I think, has gotten more attention for not just the point you made about we got to stop play defense and we can't be perfect, but because of the move to the cloud, digital modernization, the importance of services. It's going to a office and fill out a piece of paper, and nobody not only wants to do that, a lot of times it's just not easily done. And then the cloud has played a role of making resilience hopefully easier. Is that maybe part of those maybe the two factors of why so much focus on resiliency as we've seen recently?
I think so, and cloud is kind of a double-edged sword, right? It makes some things really easy, but it also means you don't control everything in a data center anymore. You now could have 200 or more different applications run by third parties, and you have to have a really strong understanding of what's the responsibility of that third party to protect your data in their environment, and you have to sort of multiply that by knowing where is your sensitive, your regulated, your more tricky data to deal with. And different cloud providers have different SLAs, service level agreements, and all of that may be spelled out in contracts, hopefully, if you've done it correctly.
I like that, hopefully. Sometimes it doesn't always, the hope is what we have. Let's maybe talk a little bit about that. When you talk to clients, whether in the state and local sector or the federal sector or the private sector, what are some of the things you're seeing about that understanding of resiliency, and how are they starting to apply some of those tools and capabilities?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that we're still pretty early in organizations moving into the cloud from local on-premise data center installs, and they're coming with some assumptions about how cloud works, and they're making an assumption maybe that the cloud provider is doing their backups or their cloud provider is protecting their data, and they're not understanding this concept of shared responsibility model, where it's very explicit from the cloud provider perspective that they're going to take care of some things and you, the state and local government or federal government, must take care of some other things. So it's that shared responsibility model is a new concept out there. And in moving to the cloud, you no longer have consolidated view of your data. It's sprawling everywhere. It's all over the place. So just knowing what data you have, who's got it, who's accountable for it, how are you going to recover it? What's the most critical stuff that has to be recovered, and how do you maintain cyber resilience in the face of all of that and the emerging threats in the landscape?
Those assumptions, we've been talking about the cloud now for more than a decade. Is it just a not understanding of what plays the role? You mentioned shared responsibility. Is it not doing a good enough job saying, okay, Gayle, you're responsible for these 5 things, and Jason's responsible for these 5 things, and then here's the things we're both responsible for? Is it just that those specifics just aren't happening enough?
Yeah, I think there's not always a lot of education on the side of the organization about where those layers of responsibility are, right? So If your organization is responsible, it has data, you're responsible for that data, and you can't assume that the cloud providers are necessarily going to assume responsibility for protecting your data. They provide the place where your data is stored, where it's processed, but it's ultimately your data and your responsibility. And I think that may not be well understood sometimes as they're making that transition into cloud, and it's new for them. And they may have a different experience depending on the cloud provider and what they're moving and when.
Maybe I'll throw a little bit of a curveball at you. Anything come to mind, maybe a story, an anecdote where you saw a client kind of suffer through this and had to learn the hard way? Again, understanding that there's some sensitivities, you want to anonymize it, but anything come to mind that you like, here's a good example of this happening?
Yeah, so I'm aware of particular county government, right, who sort of assumes that if the cloud provider is following FedRAMP, that they're going to maintain 3 copies of the data, right? Because that's a FedRAMP requirement. But if that cloud provider is actually configured for locally redundant storage, it's not the same thing as knowing you have a copy of your data in Seattle and Virginia and Ohio.
Interesting. And then if they have a cyber attack and they need to recover that, it becomes a lot more difficult to recover because of how that's centralized.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
The other thing when we talk about resilience, there's a lot of metrics that we want to focus on. What makes good cyber resilience? How do you measure, hey, are we doing a good job?
Yep. It's really all about measuring a combination of things. You've got to be able to measure your defenses and how effective they are. So how often are you getting hit with attempts to, get in, and how is your defense in that situation? If you do get hit, what is your mean time to detect, MTTD, which is basically how long does that adversary sit in your environment before you realize they're there, right? And then what's your time to recover? If you have an incident and they ransom your data, do you have an air-gapped immutable copy somewhere that you can use to restore from, right? Think about the Maersk incident that happened years ago, right? They were down for a really long time because they didn't have immutable data backups. The backups are compromised, and that's essentially what the adversaries are going after. So you've got to make sure that you have good copies of your backups. You can recover from that. You can also look at metrics like making sure that you're assessing all of your critical suppliers, because your supply chain really matters now, especially as everything sprawls out to different providers and different, third-party agent application providers. So are you assessing all of your critical suppliers? Do you know which of the suppliers are handling your critical data? And, how are they doing? Are they meeting the expectations you have for security for that data?
I want to go back to a couple of these. Mean time to detect. How do you measure that, right? I mean, we have one. How long did it take us? Well, that's a very difficult thing. I mean, it is. I had the conversation just previously with Ken Weeks from the CISO at New Hampshire and said to Ken, sometimes you got to prove the negative. Like that's hard, the hardest part of cyber.
So that one in particular is almost a forensic look back, right? You only kind of capture it in the after action when you realize something's happened and you go back and you find the logs, find the indicators of compromise that indicate that something has happened. But you can measure that. And,
Can you also do an exercise? I mean, are you seeing some state and local governments, federal governments exercising against, okay, what if we had this? How long could we do?
This is a great question, because one of the things that's brand new in NIST 853 Rev 5 is the requirement to do something called red team exercise, right? And the idea behind the red team exercise is that you basically want to attack yourself, right? So that you're testing your ability to detect. So you're testing your SOC, your Security Operations Center. So red team exercise is a great way to do that multiple times a year. You don't tell them you're coming, but it's, friendly fire. And you can then measure that and see how you're doing.
The other piece of this is time to recover. Same challenge, right? How long did it take us to recover? Well, we have to get attacked first. I imagine the testing comes in there too.
Correct. You test all of that. And there's a couple different metrics in there. One would be your recovery point objective, right? So how often are you taking snapshots of your data that you can then protect so that is it 10 minutes? Is it 30 minutes? Is the best you can do yesterday, right? That's your recovery time objective. How much data are you going to lose if you get hit? And the other part of that is that was the recovery point objective, right? The recovery time objective is how long does it take you to get back up and running? And really that depends on, are you approaching critical data first? And do you have that immutable air-gapped backup that allows you to quickly restore and recover and make sure that that backup wasn't compromised too?
That I love the discussion about the air gap data, because I think with ransomware, as the increase in ransomware, that's almost feels like a no-brainer. But is it? I mean, do you find that clients are we've got to do this now, or are they like, oh, we'll get to it, it's on our list, you know?
It's a little confusing for cloud transformation, right? Because it used to be you would run backup data tapes. You would take those tapes in a box and take them off site and store them at Iron Mountain or some similar place, and it gets tucked away in storage and you don't have to think about it again. With cloud, you have to explicitly plan for that and use tools designed for that and make sure that you build that into your resilience plan, because that's a key part of your recovery.
One of my first big stories I broke was when VA lost their tapes, the actual hard tapes, and they exposed something like 26 million veterans' data.
And some people never tested that they could ever recover from them.
Those backup tapes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the other piece of this, I think, is the testing. Again, we talked about testing on the time to recover and the time to detect. I mentioned you also have to test that air gap piece. Okay, is it really air gapped, and how much? Again, is it from an hour ago? Is it from 10 minutes ago? How often are we
It's all
doing
about that snapshot, right? So that recovery point objective, it is determined by your snapshots, and you have to be testing that too.
As agencies or state and local governments or whomever kind of continue down this path of resilience, what are some of the big obstacles, potholes that they often fall in? Is it not understanding those SLAs as we talked about, or are you starting to see something else where this is the next thing they really start to need to consider?
A lot of it is not understanding that shared responsibility model. Who's responsible for what? And is that in your contract? Did you contract for that? Because if you assume you have it, but you didn't contract for it, you don't have it.
I think going forward, as we talk more about resiliency, I think, is there a way to kind of, if you will, add more pressure on organizations? And pressure maybe isn't the right word, but education and training.
Yeah.
Is that the other piece that has to happen?
Training is huge and testing is huge. And both of those do take resources away from already strapped resources. Yeah. So it's a balancing act, but you have to find time to test and to train.
And then the other piece, of course, I think is how to make the lives of those who are doing the testing and training easier through automation, through tools that can help you. Hey, we can do this instead of 6 weeks, 2 weeks, and that way you can use those other 4 weeks for other things. How much of automation is playing a role in this? I know a lot, but what are you starting to see?
There are companies out there like Rubrik who help make that easier, right? So companies that can automate that sort of thing for you, the orchestrated recovery can be much quicker with the right tools. And that's a big part of your resilience plan.
Gayle, I really very much enjoyed our conversation. The resiliency is a topic I'm sure we will cover a lot more, especially as the cyber threats continue to evolve and increase. But we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Gayle Berkeley is the Director of Information Security at Rubrik. Thank you so much, Gayle.
Thank you.